Hey everyone, today we're looking at the evilest killers of Dead by Daylight, or the equally not so evil ones. I'll be putting all the killers into one of 4 tiers. The first tier is the literally should not be killers tier, we then have the misguided, manipulated or confused tier, then the bad people with some humanity tier, and finally the horrendous and irredeemable tier for the killers who deserve to be in the deepest depths of hell. Okay, so going into the first tier of literally should not be killers. First off we have the Spirit. Spirit is possibly the least deserving of her role as a killer. She is literally just a normal person with a bad family history of anger. She's studying at college, trying to do well, but it's hard for her father to keep up college payments, so he breaks and cuts her to pieces and kicks her out of a window. The closest thing we get to Rin becoming a killer-esque is when 2 bullies approach her in the street. They attack her, and this time she decides to fight back, letting out some inner rage and channeling her ancestors. But yeah, I really don't think Rin should realistically be classified as a killer by any means, at least prior to her time in the entity's realm. For the killer roster, she is by far the closest we get to just a regular person. Next up we have the twins. The twins are also very innocent. However, the twins, despite their overwhelming innocence, do still kill a decent amount of people in attempts of survival. Although all of these are done in self-defense with no other option available, as they are literally being hunted down for their entire lives since birth. And why? Well, because of the fact that they were conjoined at birth. It was considered that there was some kind of witchcraft involved. As a consequence, their mother was burned in front of them and left them to defend themselves as just children. They were then captured and experimented on by a creepy cult. Victor then died, leaving Charlotte alone for what was likely about a decade, and through all this time, the only time they killed was when they had to, because they were being constantly hunted. If they could have chosen to be left alone, they would have. It's really sad, to be honest. Next up we have the Hag. The only reason Hag is slightly higher than the other two is because she did make a conscious choice to use the hexes and magic, where some of the others simply had things imposed upon them. She did not deserve it by any means, but despite seeing what it did to her friend, she continued using them. Lisa is a person who was kidnapped and tortured and basically eaten alive, and she only killed when she finally managed to break free of her chains, after pleading the entity to free her, to then exact revenge upon the people that kidnapped her. She was dealt a rough hand with where she was born in a creepy secluded village surrounded by magic, so the extent to which it's her fault is debatable. Plague is one of the more innocent characters on the killer roster who is actually more of a savior if anything. After Babylon, Adiris' home city gets overrun by a deadly plague, Adiris does all she can to help her people, even cutting off her toe to try and save a woman from the plague, as an offering to the gods. She makes a final push by banishing herself from her own city to try and protect her people. In her dying breath, she begs the gods to save her people, seemingly in return for her giving herself up to them. Plague does a few human sacrifices, but you have to remember that she was living in an entirely different time, where that kind of thing was actually seen as quite positive. She does also kill her mentor Haban, but this kind of comes under the same thing of it being seen as a thing that needed to happen for the city to be saved. Although we could probably technically count that as a proper kill. Philip is one of the most tragic characters in Dead by Daylight, as the guy is actively trying to avoid violence and death, but it always seems to seek him out and find him, so much so that he eventually breaks. The first time he kills is after a group of men during a war mutilate and kill his mentor, leaving her for dead. His parents are also killed during this war. The second time is upon discovery that his boss has been secretly getting him to crush people to death in the compactor at Autohaven Wreckers. However, he never wanted to do any of these things. He only does kill when he's really pushed to the limit of trauma. Evil found him despite him always wanting to avoid it. He's just a bit high here because he does have an option to not kill these people. Nurse is a tricky one because in her tome lore she's kind of horrendous and honestly pretty irredeemable, hating people simply for being weak and sick. The thing is, many have disputed the tome lore, stating that it completely contradicts everything we know about the nurse prior. She seemed caring and put in a rough situation after her husband dies. She can barely survive off the money she earns at Crota's Pren, only breaking after being subjected to 2 decades of work at the asylum. Even when in the realm, she is shown to care, and according to the devs, she was mentioned to be one of the most human killers, so personally I think she just about makes it here. Okay, now we're into the misguided, manipulated or confused tier. Both Susie and Joey are here from the Legion as 2 characters who do some bad stuff, sure, but are only pushed over the edge by Legion's leader Frank. At the moment of the Legion's first kill, they are heavily resistant to doing the kill and appear outright scared that Frank has stabbed someone, as you would be. These 2 are greatly misguided and confused, and in impressionable as young people. I don't think they are completely innocent though, as after this they do follow up with the cover-up of evidence, and don't show any restraint afterwards to Frank getting them to stab the store clerk. Also, they're shown to commit a bunch of crimes throughout the lore too, and they seemingly have very little remorse. Trapper is here, but very debatably so, as he is still kind of a mass murderer, which, you know, is a little hard to defend for the case of him not being a killer, but from reading the lore it is quite evident that Trapper was greatly manipulated by the entity, and due to the entity's great power, there was very little he could do to actually resist it. Despite this, we know that Trapper did try and resist the entity even when in its realm. As a child, Evan is kind and caring and is heavily opposed to his father's mistreatment of the Macmillan workers. His father appears to frame him for beating a worker, and the entity seems to greatly corrupt Evan's mind. He's not innocent, but I also don't think he's anywhere close to being evil. If the corruption was not there, then Evan would not be a killer probably. However, I'm putting him just up here due to just how high his kill count is, to be honest. Okay, so now we have Bubba. I'll be honest, it feels a little weird to put a character who literally eats humans this low, but Bubba seemingly just really doesn't know what's going on. He's abused at his household and forced to kill, which he quite clearly hates doing, all under the guise of it being a needed thing to defend his home. It doesn't make it right, but he also seems to not know any better and kills to please his family members. Killing appears to scare him and make him feel incredibly guilty. I would put him lower, but I mean he still kind of kills and eats people, so, you know. Deathslinger is a weird one because by the sounds of his name he sounds like he'd be one of the more irredeemable characters, but really he's not so bad. Despite his name, he's only killed 4 confirmed people, and even then his kills are more excusable being from the American Midwest in the late to mid 1800s, where things were generally a little more wild and lawless than they are now. The only thing that Caleb can be condemned for is his creation of the spear gun, which on first use tears a man's intestines out. However, it's mentioned that this was not meant to happen and was just a design flaw, as he later perfects the weapon to capture people alive. Caleb is corrupt, but he gets to the situation he's in because of those more corrupt than him abusing his intelligence and selling on his patents. As things go for these killers, Caleb is actually one of the more reasonable ones, as strange as that sounds. Anna is a lot like Bubba in the sense that she has a childlike mind and she doesn't really understand the extent of violence that she's committing, but doing it out of a need to protect herself. However, she does still kill a lot of people who come through her woods, and she does steal children from nearby villages as she thinks she's protecting them, but instead doesn't think to feed them, which means they starve to death. There's only so much of an extent to which you can argue ignorance for her doing bad things. However, I still want to put her in this tier, as in a way I think it's like blaming an animal for acting in its own nature to protect its territory, which as we know Huntress is very territorial and wolf or bear-like, even described in her lore. Okay, now we're into the bad people with some humanity tier. Billy is a hard one to put here, to be honest, as he has a very sad story where he's abused and used. But the thing that tips me over the edge and makes me put him here is the fact that he clearly has a high degree of enjoyment when it comes to killing. He says he enjoys holding the mushed up brains of a police deputy in his hands, and he does some pretty messed up stuff like chuck a live person into a pig pen to be eaten alive. The guy he chucks to the pigs is horrible, but that's still a horrendous thing to do to another person. However, the motives for him to be this way are there, as he's abused by his parents all his life, kept in a lightless room and treated worse than the animals of Coldwin Farm. His story is sad, but there's tragedy also in that his conditioning to be this way seemed to have changed him now to be a killer by nature, even if he wasn't originally. Amanda Young has a pretty traumatic time. As a recovering drug addict, she is forced into Jigsaw's trials, which she survives, and later seems to think of them as a good thing that saved her and made her value her life more. She then joins Kramer to help him with the trials. She then starts rigging the trials to be unfair, making them so there's no redemption to them and no way of escape. This contradiction to what saved her seems kind of evil. She was turned around by this event, but she seems to want to simply torture others. I think she definitely does have redeeming factors though, and her story is one of tragedy even if she goes off the rails closer to the end and the point of her death. Julie and Frank of the Legion are both very messed up people with incredibly dodgy morals. They are only really here because they aren't shown to be complete psychopaths as they formed the Legion to begin with. It could be argued that they exploit the innocence of Susie and Joey, but it seems from their lore they are actually friends. Their kill count is not high, but their desire to be murderers and criminals displays how bad they really are. They have these big discussions in the lore about their favorite killers and stuff like that. They're super weird and they have this strange superiority complex to them. Their only humanity and redemption, I would say, is their camaraderie with each other in the Legion. Blight is a weird one, to be honest, and it's kinda hard to tell whether he's bad or just like very unaware of the amount of bad stuff that he spreads through the world. During the Opium War, he experiments on prisoners and attempts to make a super soldier serum basically, to try and allow people to withstand pain. So this is pretty bad, but then he is seemingly unaware of the many people that his serum has killed unknowingly to him. It's seemingly hundreds or thousands. This, I think, makes him bad, just for the fact that he's done experiments on humans, but it's this point where he clearly shows remorse and he's shocked by the horrors that he's created. So I think there is something in him that is definitely human, as after this event he attempts to turn his life around and experiment in other ways. So partly misguided, but I think for what he did, he's still pretty evil. Although Oni is the most prolific murderer in the game, the reason why he isn't number one is because although he's a horrendous person, he still has some sort of motive for his killing. However bad that motive is, he has somewhat of a reason in wanting to protect his legacy and the legacy of the samurai. He's not just outright killing because he enjoys it. He gets carried away, sure, his motives are bad ones, but there is still more of a reason than simply wanting to kill. Further, upon killing his own father, there is quite clearly a moment where he shows emotion and remorse, before realizing himself that he is too far gone and must finish what he started. Okay, now we're moving on to those who are horrendous and irredeemable. Demo is the lowest in this tier, as a character who is just kind of a mindless killer following orders. It's a creature built for the sole purpose of death, which its huge claws, thousands of teeth, and ability to resist most form of human attack kind of exemplifies. It's built for death, and so it is irredeemable, as it doesn't really have a personality nor redeeming qualities, as it's inhuman and built for the purpose of death and the destruction of worlds. Not much else to say. As a bioweapon built for killing, he's not exactly in a good place when it comes to redemption. Nemesis, I consider putting him lower as a killer who was programmed to do what he does, but I think we should just look at him as he is currently. In that regard, a lot like the demo, he's just a machine built for killing. But I think he is slightly higher than the demo, as in Resident Evil 3 he does seem to appear to enjoy hunting Jill. There are many parts in the game when he could have easily killed her, but he instead decides to toy with her, chucking her around and playing with his food, which definitely makes him more sadistic than something that is just built for destruction. He also appears to get enjoyment out of the different weapons he uses, such as a rocket launcher and flamethrower. It's hard to put him higher though, as he's literally programmed this way. Pyramid Head is a little bit like Demo and Nemesis, also in the sense that he's for the purpose of causing pain and built to be a killer. However, I think with Pyramid Head there's more of an intent and more evil within, stating in his lore that he's a sadistic and merciless executioner who is fixated on dispensing punishment through pain. Where Demo is more about efficient killing, Pyramid Head is built for a more pain-inducing method. Despite this, he still lacks a great degree of personality and acts as a means to punish others. He's not doing it on his own volition, as when he is done with torturing someone, he goes into something called the long rest until he is needed again. So unlike other killers, he sees this as more of a duty, even if he is very sadistic and arguably evil. Ghosty is someone who in his lore kills meticulously and methodically, staying undetected and moving from town to town in order to continue killing. He clearly enjoys what he does, as seen in this Mori. Further in the lore, he writes in the newspaper about his own murders and creates somewhat of a narrative around his own identity as the Ghostface Killer. This game he plays around killing people and just how precise he is makes him quite simply irredeemable when you see how much he likes doing what he does. Based on Clown's lore, he is quite clearly a psychopath with very little value placed on life of any kind. He begins by killing animals and then people, claiming trophies as he does. He falls into drugs, drinking and junk food and continues killing whilst with the travelling circus, claiming fingers as he does. Choosing them based on which tastes the best, which, you know, is kinda gross. This guy is horrible and disgusting, and there is simply no redemption to him. The Trickster is a lot like Ghostface in the way that he's just very sadistic and seems to greatly enjoy killing people. What makes Trickster worse though, I think, is that he not only tortures and kills people, but he then goes and makes music out of their screams too. Later in his lore, he then creates a whole performance with lots of people's screams, seeming incredibly happy whilst doing so. We can see this in game with his constant little comments and laughs when throwing his knives. With someone in his position of power and fame, it makes it even more scary that he is so messed up and grotesque in the way he acts. Freddy, before getting killed, works at a primary school where he abused children prostitution and did lots of other disgusting things. He then goes on to murder a bunch of them when they're older just because he's an awful and irredeemable person. There's really not much to say about Freddy. He torments people in their dreams and terrifies them in directed and personal ways. Yep, this guy is horrible and definitely one of the worst in the game. Doctor is a horrendous person who commits dreadful acts, experimenting on people in truly grotesque ways, and experimenting into electroshock therapy in very messed up ways, often causing tremendous amounts of pain. Doctor is like Blight except without that remorse. If you look at any of his cutscenes, you can see that he greatly enjoys his messed up experiments, also evident in game by his constant laughter. Myers is kind of hard to dispute as the most evil killer, as he is literally defined as such, stated to be purely and simply evil by Dr. Loomis, who studies him for over a decade. It's kinda hard to argue otherwise. As soon as he escapes prison, he literally goes right back to killing, doing it efficiently and without a shred of remorse. In a way, he's more menacing than Doctor, as his kills are done without the motive of experimentation, but simply his motive being the need and desire to kill. Not as a job, but more so it being that he simply does because he's evil. Alright, that's gonna do it. I do hope you enjoyed. Let me know how you'd rank these characters. Thanks, and goodbye.